Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're skipping the big headline declaration and really getting into the plumbing of policy, the bureaucratic amendment.
That's right.
We're diving into Executive Order 14200. It's all about the synthetic opioid supply chain, but through the, well, very specific lens of customs law.
Exactly. And this one, it needs a deep dive because it's technical, it's very targeted, and it's really about plugging a specific gap.
A loophole.
Essentially, yes. EO 14200, signed
Okay.
February 5th, 2025 by President Trump. It specifically amends duties on certain goods from the People's Republic of China.
And the timeline here is just fascinating, isn't it? The original duties, the main policy, that was announced just 4 days earlier.
Right.
February 1st.
The third day.
That kind of rapid follow-up, it tells you straight away, doesn't it? That the first order must have created some immediate problem, something overlooked or maybe unforeseen that needed a quick fix.
Absolutely. The complication.
So our mission today is to really unpack the core mechanism of this fix, this EO 14200, so you can understand how high-stakes policy sometimes bumps up against the realities of the customs system.
Okay, so to ground us,
Yeah.
the full title is Amendment to Duties Addressing the Synthetic Opioid Supply Chain in the People's Republic of China. Signed on the 5th, like you said, but it actually got published in the Federal Register as EO 14200 on February 11th.
Okay.
That publication, 90 FR 9277, it's basically the official confirmation that this big policy push, using tariffs to disrupt opioid precursors, needed some pretty immediate fine-tuning.
Okay, let's start at the foundation then. These orders, they aren't just wishes, they need serious legal backing. And the list of authorities cited here, it feels, well, heavier than usual for just trade issues.
It is.
Can you walk us through why these specific acts are invoked, especially the emergency powers?
Yeah, absolutely. What's really crucial for you to understand is that this policy, it's not just based on, say, standard trade talks or tariff rules. It's framed as national security. So the main legal pillars here are the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, that's IEEPA, and also the National Emergencies Act.
IEPA.
Right.
When we see that specific act cited, what does that signal immediately about how the executive branch views this crisis?
Well, it signals two big things. First, that the administration has formally declared the synthetic opioid supply chain, or parts of it, an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security, foreign policy, and the economy. That's the legal threshold IEPA demands.
Okay. A high bar.
It is. And second, maybe more practically, IEPA gives the president a lot more flexibility and speed to put economic restrictions in place. It lets them bypass the slower steps you often see in standard trade law.
Which allows for speed, like imposing duties quickly.
Exactly, which is what the February 1st order did. It used that power.
So declaring it a national emergency unlocks that speed rather than just relying on something like, say, Section 301 of the Trade Act, which I see is also cited here.
Right, Section 301 is there too, providing additional trade authority. But IEPA is really about the emergency footing.
Does using the National Emergencies Act and IEPA open this up to different legal challenges compared to, say, standard tariffs?
It potentially could, yes. The underlying declaration of an emergency can sometimes be challenged in court. But historically, courts tend to be pretty deferential to the president on national security judgments under IEPA.
So less likely to succeed, maybe?
Generally, yes. For our purposes today, citing IEPA really highlights the perceived urgency and gives the White House the strongest legal tool to enforce these duties, even if they hit implementation snags later. Which brings us neatly to this amendment.
Perfect timing. So we know EO 14200 is specifically an amendment to fix something in the February 1st order. And Section 1 of this new EO, that's where the action is. It replaces a subsection G with new text. And it's all about something called duty-free de minimis treatment.
Exactly.
This sounds technical, but it seems like it's targeting maybe an enforcement blind spot.
That's precisely what it's doing. But before we get into the new language, we probably need to quickly define what de minimis even means, right?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so de minimis, it's actually written into law, 19 U.S.C. 1321, and it's really important for global trade, especially e-commerce now. For years, this rule has basically allowed low-value shipments to come into the U.S. without facing duties or taxes.
Low value meaning?
Currently, the threshold is generally understood to be around $800 per shipment. So stuff under that value often just sails through customs, duty-free.
Okay, why does that rule exist in the first place, and how does it become a loophole for something like opioid precursors?
Well, it exists mainly for efficiency. Just imagine the sheer volume of packages coming in every day, millions of them from online orders. If Customs, CBP, had to stop and assess duty on every single $10 or $20 package,
The system would
it
collapse.
would grind to a halt. Exactly. The cost of collecting those tiny duties would be way more than the revenue you'd get. So that $800 threshold helps speed things up.
Makes sense.
The loophole happens because, well, someone trying to avoid the new duties on, say, larger chemical shipments might figure out they could just break down their product, ship the covered articles in hundreds, maybe thousands of small packages, each valued under $800.
So they slip under the radar using the de minimis rule.
Precisely. They'd bypass the duty intended by the February 1st order, and it makes tracking much, much harder.
Okay. So the original duties were broad, but the logistics at the border meant small packages could still get through duty-free. This new IO, 14200, tries to close that loophole, but you mentioned there's a catch.
A major catch, yes. And this is where the bureaucratic genius, or maybe necessity, comes in. The new subsection, G, it's very carefully worded, it actually acknowledges that de minimis treatment is initially still available for these targeted articles.
Wait, so it doesn't close the loophole immediately? It says it's still available?
Initially, yes, it hasn't slammed the door shut yet.
Okay, so what's the trigger? When does it stop being available?
The trigger is very specific, and it's administrative, not political. The text says this duty-free treatment shall cease to be available for such articles upon notification by the Secretary of Commerce to the President that adequate systems are in place.
Notification by the Secretary of Commerce. That's interesting. Why not Customs? Or maybe Treasury, since they usually handle tariffs.
That's a really sharp observation. It is interesting. While CBP, Customs and Border Protection, they're the ones actually collecting duties at the border, the Department of Commerce often handles the underlying trade data, the classifications, the systems behind it all.
So this clause basically tells Commerce.
It effectively gives Commerce a technical job. It says you can't fully implement this part of the duty closing the de minimis loophole until you can certify that the government's IT, the computer systems, the tracking software, the payment processing is actually ready.
Ready to do what exactly?
Ready, and I quote, fully and expediently process and collect tariff revenue for all these potentially millions of low-value shipments. It's not just about wanting to close the loophole, it's about being able to handle the operational load.
Wow. Okay, that is the aha moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
A major national security policy fighting opioids is essentially put on hold, at least partially,
Temporarily, yes.
by the state of the government's computer systems. It suggests that when the first duties were announced on February 1st, they maybe didn't have the practical capability ready to handle all the small stuff.
That seems to be exactly it. Where the rubber meets the road, the technical reality kind of checks the political announcement. The goal is clear: disrupt the whole supply chain, even tiny precursor amounts shipped by express mail.
Right.
But this amendment says, okay, we'll get there, but only once the team, led by Commerce apparently, signals they've built the infrastructure needed to actually manage that flood of small dutiable packages without, breaking the entire import system.
So if we're trying to guess when these duties will fully apply, even to small packages, it depends entirely on how fast the government can upgrade its IT, not just on the date the order was signed.
That's absolutely right. Think about the administrative challenge. Assessing and collecting duties on millions of, say, $50 shipments is enormous. This amendment is basically an admission that they probably need time, months, maybe longer, to build that capacity before the de minimis exemption can finally be removed for these specific goods.
Okay, so the headlines might focus on the duties themselves, but often the real action or inaction happens in Section 2 of these orders, the general provisions, the sort of boilerplate stuff.
It often looks like boilerplate, yeah, but it can be critical. It dictates how the order gets implemented, the constraints, especially financial ones.
Let's look there then. Because as Section 1 sets up a technical hurdle, Section 2 might tell us about the resources to overcome it.
Exactly. So Section 2 starts pretty standard. Subsection A just confirms the order doesn't mess with the existing authorities of different agencies, or, importantly, the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, regarding budgets and legislation.
Right, standard turf protection. But subsection B, that gets to the money, which sounds crucial for these system upgrades we were just talking about.
It is crucial.
It says implementation has to be consistent with law, and here it is, subject to the availability of appropriations.
And that little phrase is huge. We really can't just gloss over that. It means the entire effectiveness of closing that de minimis loophole, The whole point of Section 1.
The Commerce Secretary's notification.
Right. That moment when the Secretary can finally say systems are adequate. It all depends on whether Congress actually provides the money. The funding for those complex IT systems, the personnel maybe, needed to process and collect duties on potentially millions of small items.
So if Congress doesn't appropriate the funds,
Then, well, the policy's intent to capture those small shipments is effectively stalled. Dead in the water, maybe. Regardless of what the president ordered, the systems don't get built, the notification doesn't happen, the loophole stays open.
so the battle over these opioid supply chain duties, it suddenly gets tied up in the annual budget fights on Capitol Hill. The technical need and the money have to align.
Precisely. That seemingly standard phrase ties this national security directive directly to the congressional power of the purse. It really underscores the separation of powers. The president can issue the order using IEPA, fine, but Congress holds the keys to funding the actual enforcement at this granular, small package level.
Okay, then there's subsection C, the big legal disclaimer. We see this a lot in EOs. But why is it particularly important here in an order that's messing with trade and imports?
Ah, yes, subsection C. It states very clearly that the order is not intended to and does not create any right or benefit, substantive or procedural, enforceable at law or in equity against the U.S. government. This is basically the government's liability shield.
And in a trade context, why is that shield so vital?
Well, think about it from the perspective of an importer. Once this de minimis treatment eventually ends for these specific covered articles, importers are going to face new costs, new procedures.
Right, they'll have to pay duty on things they didn't before.
Exactly. And they might be tempted to sue the government, maybe argue the implementation wasn't fair or the new systems weren't working expediently like the EO promised, causing them losses.
Okay.
This clause tries to head off those kinds of lawsuits right from the start, at least those based only on the text of the executive order itself. It reinforces that this is an act of executive authority tied to a national emergency, not some kind of commercial contract that importers can enforce in court. It protects the government while it's trying to build these complex systems, Section 1 demands.
So let's try and pull all these threads together. We have the IEEPA authority, the incredibly fast 4-day amendment, this conditional trigger based on tech readiness. What does AO 14200 tell us overall about how U.S. trade policy, especially when linked to national security, actually works on the ground?
I think it tells us it's often a story of rapid administrative reaction to, well, the messy realities of enforcement. The big policy goal, disrupt the opioid supply chain, that is clear. But this specific EO, it's an acknowledgement that without the right technical tools, and crucially, the funding for those tools,
Even a national emergency declaration can get tangled up.
exactly, tangled up in the sheer volume of global e-commerce and the efficiency rules like de minimis that make it work. It really shows how high-level policy can get bogged down in the nuts and bolts of IT systems and congressional budget cycles.
The takeaway seems to be that the policy's intent is maybe only as strong as the infrastructure that's there to back it up. The focus really shifts, doesn't it? From just wanting the duty to figuring out the mechanism to actually collect it on everything.
Yeah, that's a perfect summary. The ability to collect duty on a $10 widget coming from China, that's suddenly central to the success of this major policy initiative. And until the Commerce Secretary gives that green light on the adequate systems, that loophole for these specific items, it persists. The original duties aren't fully comprehensive yet.
Which leads us right to a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. Given that this specific amendment was needed just 4 days after the initial big order, and it includes these conditions about adequate systems and relies on availability appropriations, what does that really suggest about the level of, say, coordination or readiness that was actually in place when the administration first rolled out those sweeping duties on February 1st?
Yeah, it does raise questions, doesn't it?
It certainly raises an important point about implementation planning for any major economic policy, especially one tied so closely to national security claims, the gap between announcement and execution.
Indeed. The policy ambition was high, clearly, but the practical execution required this very quick and quite revealing administrative adjustment.
A fascinating look under the hood of policy mechanics. Thanks so much for walking us through the details.
My pleasure. Always interesting to see how these things really work.